I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing AI and ESG. How are AI and ESG connected? Well, for that, we need to start near the beginning. What is ESG? What's the status of ESG litigation? And where are those disputes headed? In doing so, we're going to start to understand, what things like our AI washing, which you may have heard about, and how AI is creating unique legal issues that will likely result in future ESG litigation. This episode, I want to note, is a continuation of our AI Mastery series on how to spot issues raised by AI across legal disciplines. If you're new to the podcast, check out some of our prior episodes in the AI series that cover ground like AI and IP, energy, cyber, antitrust. They are a great resource for learning how AI technology is creating legal issues in a variety of different ways. There is a lot of content here, and I'm excited today to add a chapter on ESG. To discuss that, I've invited my partner, David Foster, who leads our ESG litigation practice. David spends much of his days defending organizations who are subject to ESG-oriented lawsuits and counseling clients on how to avoid them. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, David, your background is in litigation, and you lead the firm's ESG litigation practice. Maybe you can first just start high level. What is ESG, and why is it giving rise to so many disputes right now?
Yeah, I think ESG is something that is very much a vague acronym that people tend to paint onto it whatever they want and whatever suits their purposes. And it's a politically charged topic. People on the right tend to paint ESG with a very negative and nefarious brush, whereas people with other political beliefs tend to view ESG as a very positive thing that fits all of the kind of things that they are focused on promoting. So the question of what is ESG is actually a very controversial topic. To be really precise, it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And what fits within each of those buckets, particularly the governance one, it is hard to pin down exactly. Governance, for example, could include just about anything that a public company does, especially anything that happens in the boardroom. So typically, though, when people are talking about ESG and controversies about ESG, they're talking about the E, which is environmental, or the S, which is social. Social would typically include things like human rights, the rights of people who are participating in a supply chain, or most controversially now, DEI or DE&I, which is a topic that's generating a lot of litigation.
So if I think about where those disputes arise, I think typically it's around disclosure, right? It's almost like this is, a lot of folks who are working consumer protection who follow this podcast. So folks who would say, I know, I have to describe when I'm trying to sell something that I describe it one way, it can't be something totally different. And we are, in this case, maybe perhaps describing the different activities that an organization is undertaking that would fall within those bounds of ESG. And it turns out the claims are that those are inaccurate. Is that giving rise to where the litigation rests?
I think that's basically right. And as I have had this role at the firm for a couple of years now, my thinking on that has evolved a little bit. The way that I think about it now is that companies are putting out a lot of information about how sustainable they are and how they approach corporate social responsibility, basically. And so just about any public company these days has an ESG report. Some might call it a sustainability report. Some may have their own brand name for it. Some just call it an ESG report. But at the end of the day, those reports contain a lot of disclosure that companies are putting out that they weren't doing 10 or 15 years ago, and maybe not even just a few years ago. And the way that I think about ESG litigation is that as companies are saying more and more about ESG, they're getting sued more and more about those statements. And so it could be that they're being sued because the statements are inaccurate. like you say, or they're allegedly inaccurate. But they also could be sued because, or investigated, because other actors out there, plaintiffs, government officials, members of Congress, politicians, disagree with the priorities that the company has selected. So, for example, a company may say, we are going to invest a certain amount in combating climate change, or we're not going to do business with companies that have X, Y, or Z environmental problem. It may be that a red state attorney general, for example, disagrees with those priorities and thinks that the company is committing some sort of wrong or waste by investing in those issues. And so that company could then be sued based on those statements. The other thing that happens sometimes is that companies disclose information about issues in their that are challenging in their operations. For example, this would be a case, an example of that would be human rights issues that a company may have, for example. They talk about those things. They talk about the difficult issues that they're trying to overcome or they're investing to overcome problems. And sometimes plaintiffs come out of the woodwork and say, actually, by trying to fix that problem, you are admitting that you're the source of the problem and you should be sued for that too. So there are all kinds of things in which, or different fact patterns in which these reports will crop up in litigation. And those are just a few examples.
Yeah. And I'm guessing, right, as you help defend organizations who are alleged to have engaged in either a practice around, misallocation of corporate resources or some sort of deception, that the key element of that is going to rely on data. Importantly, if organizations set out a commitment around having diversity goals within their workforce, having commitments surrounding the amount of carbon that they are producing in the world, there's going to be a lot of key questions here that are going to come up around how is it to count and to classify, and how is it that we are putting that out in the world for there to consume, to create the perception that one thing has happened, and then arguably it sounds like plaintiffs are alleging that that data is either misrepresentative, inaccurate, misleading, any number of different allegations.
That's right. And I think one of our colleagues actually once mentioned to me in an one of my first conversations about ESG that I had a few years ago at the firm, described ESG and the kind of increasing focus on ESG as a data creation event. Because what we're seeing in the market, and what we've been seeing for the last few years, is that for a variety of different reasons, companies are disclosing a lot more information about their sustainability, about their supply chains, about the due diligence they do in their supply chains, about the composition of their companies, about DEI, about their priorities and values. And a lot of that information is being driven by the market, where, if a competitor says something about how sustainable they are, then your company is going to want to make the same statement because they're worried about losing customers if they're not perceived as being as green as the competition. And the other thing is actually hard regulations that we're seeing predominantly in Europe that have been slowly but progressively coming online over the course of the last couple of years, and projecting forward into the next few years. A lot of companies in Europe, or US companies that are doing business there, are going to be subject to a variety of different reporting schemes that have some things in common with US reporting schemes, and in some ways they're conflicting or slightly different. All of that is creating essentially a big soup of information that is out there. And we know that plaintiffs' lawyers are looking at that information. They're looking for admissions, they're looking for inconsistencies, they're looking for commitments that companies are making that they think a jury or a judge would not be on board with. And this is why this has become a very fraught issue. It's why a firm like Hogan Lovells has someone like me who's in charge of developing business around ESG litigation, which if someone had said to me 5 years ago, what's ESG litigation? I would have said, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it's that soup of information and data that really is driving the work here that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I'm just interested in kind of maybe some examples about how those are popping up, because for those who are in the cyberspace here, like The FTC has long taken action against organizations who will, say, hey, we offer a secure product, right? Or, that this product is going to be free from, XYZ security. And as probably most security professionals know, it's really impossible standard for them to say just that. And I think maybe the market has kind of shifted a little bit to now maybe not make so confident of claims surrounding the security of a particular product. But I still think, and you can tell me if it's replace kind of secure product to eco-friendly or sustainable or any of these other kind of things that indicate that there is an environmentally friendly component without necessarily a real definition about what that means. It's almost like, whenever you go to a supermarket and you buy something organic and you're like, well, what is that means? Because you can see, like, if you look at the list of ingredients, there's a whole bunch of things that you cannot pronounce. And was that organic or not? I'm sure there's a technical definition that I'm not aware of, much like I'm not sure what it means to be eco-friendly or sustainable. My guess is that is also resulting in a fair number of disputes.
That's absolutely the case. And I think, in particular, with the statements about sustainability, companies years ago, if you go back, pretty much universally had their sustainability statements housed in marketing, right? And so what you had was companies that were going out and making statements about things like greenhouse gas emissions, things like their commitment to diversity or to treating workers in their downstream supply chain with respect in a compliant way. Those statements were made in the glossiest, sort of flashiest way possible by marketing people, and the lawyers weren't thinking about it because it was not perceived as a source of legal risk. That has very much changed, although it hasn't universally changed. So a lot of companies are moving these types of reporting. They're imposing more legal oversight on these types of processes and these types of disclosures, whether that is by even putting them underneath the responsibility of the GC, or at least having people in the legal department at companies that are responsible for overseeing anything that touches on these issues. That's a very significant move that we've seen in the last couple of years.
And so if you start seeing that, and if you start seeing those issues pop up, I'm guessing, that I think has previously gone by the name of greenwashing. And now as I teased at the very start of this episode, these issues are now being presented as concerns in the AI space. And there's even phrases now like AI washing. Interested in your perspective about what that is and where do you see those issues starting to percolate?
Yeah. So washing is one of those terms that, like, I think started with greenwashing, and now there are all kinds of different colors that are associated with. I saw the reference to blue washing. I'm not totally sure what that is, but greenwashing basically is the concept of, you're describing yourself in a way that makes you sound all green and kind of warm and fuzzy when really you're not that. And AI washing, I think, is a related concept in the sense that there is a perception, and this is my understanding of it, that AI is a powerful thing for marketing. And if something is described as being based on AI, then that may have an enhanced value in the market. And I can say, just from my own experience, I've noticed some things that I've been using for years and years now have kind of AI built into the way that they're described to me. And I don't know if AI is part of those products or services or not. But I think what you can expect is that plaintiffs' lawyers, regulators, state attorneys general, the FTC probably will be taking a very hard look at that. There are examples of cases that have been filed that address the AI washing kind of theory already. And the greenwashing cases, I think, are out ahead of those cases. So we have a pretty good sense of, I think that's a model for where that type of litigation is likely headed, which, I'm happy to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because as you pointed out, there are all of these existing things. And then when all of a sudden AI became the buzz, everything all of a sudden, this product powered by AI or this, product AI, like I have not yet seen like someone say like Scott Loughlin powered by AI, but eventually there's probably going to be a lawyer out there be like, oh, I'm this one powered by AI. And
that's what I'm aspiring. I'm aspiring to that.
Yeah, David Foster powered by AI. Nice.
Yeah, sounds easy.
But I think more generally, right, key question is, are those statements true? Or to what extent are you really powered by AI or enabled by AI or whatever it is you're going to say about AI? Or is this really the same function as saying, like, I have a secure product? And then the fact that that product led not to be secure, resulting in liability, or perhaps, something that other organizations have recently got into hot water with the FTC is to say, I am a HIPAA compliant product, even though they're not subject to HIPAA and frankly probably took no steps to comply with HIPAA, but they used it as a buzzword and thus as for marketing purposes, and thus then created exposure which wouldn't have otherwise existed.
Yeah. And I think that's all exactly right. And the thing that I would say to underscore here is, based on the experience we have with ESG, I think we can map this out a little bit, kind of where these cases are going to head. And I'll give you a few examples. So first of all, state attorneys general are very focused on tech, right? They're very focused on consumer-facing misrepresentation. So that's one side. So state AGs, the FTC, I think I would put in that same bucket. This is also probably a nonpartisan issue. Unfortunately, for people in the tech side, there's certain industries that are equal opportunity punching bags for politicians and state AGs and regulators, and this is probably one of those that both Republicans and Democrats will look hard at. But the other thing that I would flag here is securities risk, because if a company is describing itself as AI powered, for example, that could have an effect on investors too, or at least I could imagine a theory that would stress that. And on the sustainability side, as companies describe themselves as sustainable, or as having particular sustainable practices, it's not just consumers that are coming after them. It's not just state AGs. The SEC might come after them. And one recent example of that involves Keurig, and the way that they described the recyclability of their coffee pods, the little coffee pods that we all love, for single serving coffee consumption. And the Keurig recently announced a settlement with the SEC relating to the way they described the recyclability of those pods, because the SEC took the position that it was such an important part of their business that an alleged misstatement relating to the recyclability of the pods actually was material. And the company ended up agreeing to pay a settlement without admitting liability. But that's an example of how far afield this can go. And I think there have been rumblings in the AI washing space of potential securities cases around that issue, which speaks, I think, to the importance of having a coordinated, disciplined approach to the way that a company that is operating in this area describes itself, and having substantiation for that, like just slapping the word AI on something, or trumpeting yourself as an AI company, if that isn't really what you're doing, could go way beyond just a consumer misrepresentation type claim.
So I'll give you two others, and I want your reactions to them where I
Sure.
would say that these connections may lie. First is, there is a lot of discussion and what we spend a lot of our time with and advising on AI implementations is the potential for bias and the introduction of bias, inherent bias of different types of technologies, unidentified, bias that went in connection with training data, which then results in some sort of negative outcome to a group of people. And that is one area that, to the extent that an organization uses AI to do things like sort resumes, to be able to identify candidates on a job board that would be most appropriate, that they very much will start to go directly to ESG oriented commitments that organizations made around their hiring practices, whether they knew that or not. The bias that may have been inherent in an AI tool that's used to support those functions may end up becoming an issue under prior disclosures. That's one. The other one I'd be interested in your take on is we did a prior episode with our colleagues in our energy practice, Amy Roma and Chip, were around the consumption of energy needed to support data centers that were essentially the backbone behind AI. Things where you start to say that we have to create a effectively kind of turning on 3 Mile Island nuclear generator again, the site of an historical nuclear potential disaster in this country, turning it back on to support the equivalent of one data center, right? That's how hungry AI is for power. Obviously, creation of power has a number of environmental impacts that are associated with it, including the creation of carbon. And my guess is that that would be another area where the uses, the developments and the deployments and the commercialization of AI will end up having an environmental component, which will in turn then go back to ESG oriented commitments. Interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. So on the power plant and the data center issue, that absolutely is the key environmental feature of a lot of modern tech, and being careful about what you say in your disclosures if you're a tech company around your environmental footprint, and this issue is going to be absolutely critical, and being disciplined, substantiating every statement, not overstating commitments to being green is going to be absolutely critical, given the increased power consumption that technology and especially AI seems to be driving. On the employment side, the issue around DEI goals, for example, and commitments in AI is going to be a really critical connection. DEI is something that is going to be a very hot button litigation issue for the foreseeable future. It has been for years, especially going back the last couple of years. And with the change in administration, we're expecting to see the government take a very critical look at DEI commitments, and what companies are saying about DEI, what they're doing about DEI, what their securities disclosures say about DEI, and whether, frankly, white males are being treated the same as minority groups, which is what the current trend among sort of right-leaning people who are taking power in Washington. That's what their focus is going to be, and so adding a layer of AI on top of that could be very powerful in a few different ways you can imagine. One is if there's any sort of systematic bias that is resulting from AI, then that can create significant exposures, whichever way that bias happens to be playing out. So the data that's coming in about people's characteristics, and any sort of bias that the process results in could be a source of liability. On the other hand, I could also imagine that using technology in a smart way may help companies actually defend against human biases. That we all have biases built into us the way that we are wired too. So using human beings as opposed to AI also results in bias. And the key is, from an ESG perspective, is be careful what you say, because if you overstate your commitment to DEI, if you accurately state a commitment to DEI that is illegal under current law, and that's a fact pattern that I think we're seeing more and more, where companies haven't addressed the changing, or at least have not thought about how the law may have changed, can be targets of claims. If they are perceived as operating in a world where they are favoring one race over the other. It's a long way of saying it's a very fraught area. Adding AI on top of that is going to make it even more fraught, I think. And the companies that navigate that in a smart way will be the ones that avoid, potentially very significant risks in that area.
So one important thing, Dave, that I don't want to lose sight of, because I think many folks, when they're thinking about like what does ESG look like in the new administration, is this a thing of the past, and come back perhaps in 4 years or whenever there's a change in party leadership. You're saying, yeah, but this is never going away. It's just the focus of it is going to perhaps be different, right? In other words, trying to think about DEI as trying to maybe the use of DEI programs to create a more inclusive workforce in and of itself, could be argued by others of saying that that's something that is actually resulting in some sort of other types of discrimination, which then create potential liability.
Correct.
Yeah, it's a really um, really kind of difficult set of issues, but what I would imagine, clients who are you're working with is probably those who are well advised are being thinking about this from both angles about how to protect themselves from potential legal exposure, putting aside the merits of any of these countervailing views about what these programs were designed to create.
Yeah. And let me just be really stark about it. Like ESG is really, really hard right now, and it's about to get a lot harder. And the reason I'm saying that is because in Europe and in certain US states, right, we have to keep in mind that the US is not just one government. It's 50 state governments, DC plus the federal government, and then other layers as well at the local level. And then in Europe, you have the EU that's running full speed in the direction of ESG, right? They are demanding higher levels of diligence. They're demanding higher levels of disclosure, really going in a very pro ESG direction. Meanwhile, in the US, there are some states that for years already have been pushing very hard against ESG, where ESG is basically a dirty word in some states. In some congressional committees, we shouldn't leave out Congress here, right? Congressional investigations of ESG and DEI issues have already been a big deal. And with Republicans controlling both houses of Congress next year, that is absolutely going to be a major focus of congressional investigation activity. But then you also have lots of states that have Democratic attorneys general, or in the case of California, for example, a state legislature that's passing a lot of laws that are pushing it very much in kind of like the European direction on ESG. So what do you do if you are a big multinational company that has to operate in Europe and that has to get along in the United States, that doesn't want to get a subpoena from Congress, that doesn't want to be investigated by red state AGs? How do you walk that line, right? And that tension between sort of this sort of rock in the hard place here is a very significant part of the work that we do at the firm. And I didn't realize that at all when I was coming into. I signed up for this ESG litigation leadership role. That what a lot of the work that we actually spend our time doing is talking to multinational companies and figuring out how do you deal with these potentially conflicting issues? How do you avoid how do you comply in one and not get sued in the other one? And the hard truth of it is there's not some like cookie cutter solution. Like the key is getting deep in the facts, having a team that understands your business in different countries, and getting your own enterprise, if you are a multinational company, to all kind of understand that what they say in one jurisdiction doesn't stop at the border. And so you have to be smart. You have to like read every sentence of every report and make sure that there's nothing that you're saying that's going to be a red flag for someone. All the while, of course, and this is the most important part, while being true to the values of your organization, right? Like the ESG is not something that is just like a nice to have for most companies, right? It means something different at every company. Different companies have different priorities, different focuses. But at the end of the day, what ESG is about, it's about values. And these disputes that we have in the ESG world tend to be disputes about like the core of what a company believes in, right? We've seen very big companies, very established people in the business community that are committed to their values, and they're willing to dig in and fight for them. And unfortunately, in the world that we live in, given the conflicting directions that different regulators and different jurisdictions are pointing in, that's going to be a more common fact pattern in the next few years. And the way to avoid it is to think very meticulously about it on the front end. Think about every disclosure. At the firm, we have put together a multidisciplinary group, which Scott, I know that you're participating in, to help spot issues on the front end and help coordinate companies that are dealing with the difficult decisions of what to disclose in one jurisdiction and how that could affect them somewhere else. That's something we're always happy to talk to clients about on the front end, in the hope that we don't end up having disputes or investigations to deal with on the back end.
Yeah, really important point, David. I think this is probably a lot of metaphors, but this is really around, if we want to be able to articulate values and articulate a perspective, a mission that's not just how to make as much money as possible, that is possible to do and really important. It should be rewarded. Thus, but it's also kind of no good deed goes unpunished in some ways, that you have to be very careful about how to do it, because there's a lot of traps here. To borrow another metaphor or cliche, is that there's a lot of traps here for the unwary.
Yeah. And I think there are going to be real conflicts, and there are going to be times when companies have to make a hard choice, between, do we take a risk on something, or do we back off of what our goal is or what our values are? But a lot of times, in the work that we do in this area, you don't really have to make those hard choices if you're careful. And if you sort of do the hard work of rolling up your sleeves and looking at the specific things that you're saying, frequently there are ways to walk that narrow line that will keep exposure at a minimum. And how do you do that? Like, this isn't something like a securities disclosure where there's just like the ESG lawyer that's sitting there that that can just sort of advise on this. You need a multidisciplinary approach. You need a multi-jurisdictional approach, because that is, in fact, the way that the risk is playing out. But if you do the hard work, usually there's a way to kind of square the circle and make statements that are both true to your values and that will avoid needlessly exposing a company to liability.
Yeah, really good input. So, David, maybe that's where we can leave today's episode. I really appreciate your joining the podcast, sharing areas of expertise. It sounds like these are going to be issues that are core to the way many of us think that our values are being displayed, both at the corporate level and in the way that we communicate legally, and thus going to create lots of issues for that companies are going to need your help with going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here, and always happy to talk.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.